Vivian, thank you very much. Firstly, congratulations on the study. This work really is.
No, it's important. It's important because it's granular, and we don't want to be theorists at McKinsey. The criticism of a lot of analytic research and indeed policy influencers like Asia House or McKinsey's Global Institute is it's interesting work, is probably correct, but what do I do with it?
Yes.
And so that's what we've tried to do in this case, is really make it practical.
Yeah. Reading the report and reading your presentation last night, two things struck me. Firstly, the numbers are breathtaking. 4.5 trillion in Asia, 12.8 trillion globally in terms of growth. So that's a staggering sort of numbers. But secondly, the enormity of the challenge, because you're talking about political change, cultural change, corporate change, and a very complex matrix of actions required to get even close. Where does one start?
Well, we would start with employers at work, because today there are a lot of people in employment. I mean, even if you were to say the participation rate in some countries is 20%, for example, in Indonesia, most of the women who aren't in that 20% are just not working in a recognized, accounted for part of the economy. They are working. And I think women do something like 4 to 6 times the amount of domestic work, unpaid, I should flash, unpaid domestic work that men do, and or other types of work. And of course, the gray economy as well. And so it's about getting women into work. And so I do think a lot of progress can be made with and through existing, as well as the fast growth companies that are happening there. It doesn't mean that they can do it by themselves, said at the end, but I wouldn't underestimate the importance that the private sector and the public sector, well organized, because the public sector is often the largest employer in these countries, that they can do. You can make a big difference, and we would say 60 to 70% of the initiatives can be approached through a professional context or through an employer.
Right. So the focus really is on corporate leaders,
yes,
big public service leaders, to grasp this challenge, and if they take the lead, the rest may follow.
Yes, well, they can make enough progress on their own, number one, to help their own growth, so the incentives are aligned, and secondly, they're needed as a part of the solution for good practice into government and good participation. It's not perfect in every setting, but I do think we just have to we want to give managers the confidence to act and not feel as if I act, I'll be acting on my own, or I won't be making progress that actually benefits my shareholders and owners.
Yeah. Reading through the methodology section of the summary of your report that I saw, you make the point very clearly that correlation is not causation. So there's a caveat there.
Yes.
How confident are you that there is an absolute direct link between between diversity and bottom line profitability?
Well, as we said, we have a correlation, not causation. What we've done is looked first at high performers, and we know companies that are successful do many things well. But one of the things that they do well in every country, in every sector, and in every subsector. So your successful competitors relative to you, or you relative to your successful competitors, is they have more diverse leadership teams on gender, on cultural and ethnicity. Now, there are probably other factors that contribute to high quality decision making. And if you look at a company like SAP, what they've tried to do is use 4 criteria. One is, of course, gender participation. One is what they call generation, which is about having both young technology able problem solvers participate in their businesses, but also retain judgment. Because what you want is fast, high growth, highly innovative teams, but you don't want them overly product or software focused. You actually want them to have an application and strong ethics in how you use those powerful technologies. So they call it generation, which is about tech capabilities, but also retaining judgment. You could label that young and old, but I know a few young people with good judgment and a few older people who know something about technology. But they had to learn that because they started off thinking it was generation XYZ, etc., and tech, and it turned out to be about technology, capabilities, and judgment. So they call it generation. The third area is about cognitive diversity, the type of problem solving that they do within there, and I'm not a software person, but within their software and their problem-solving analytics, they believe is most present on the autistic spectrum. And so they want to hire a lot of people who have strong capabilities in that analytic area, including particularly people with capabilities and strength on the autistic frame. And so you take something that historically might have been taboo to even talk about at work. I have colleagues who may not have even shared that they had an autistic niece or nephew or child. And you invert that to people competing to demonstrate that people are on the autistic spectrum because it's a strength, not a criticism. And then the last one, they let people tailor. They say, I don't know what's most important in Brazil or most important in Indonesia, but I'm going to let you tailor it. And so I make that point as we look forward to the panel later, to make the point that you can tailor it so that it's really relevant to your shareholders and to your people. But no one is arguing that adding a woman or adding people of a different cultural background or from a historically disadvantaged group is going to work any magic. It really is down to problem solving and decision making, and including people in the workforce such that they can contribute to improved decision making. Now in Asia, the story is actually a little easier than it is in developed markets, and this is important because simply more women in the workforce in economies that are growing as fast as they are in Asia. Think about it, Indonesia, that simply structurally will help the country be more competitive. So the first step's even even easier. It's just more women at work.
You talked about the role that digital technology can play in this. That gives Asia an advantage, doesn't it? Leapfrogging, or potentially an advantage in this space. Leapfrogging legacy systems. We know plenty of very well-developed companies that are stuck or at least hampered because they've developed systems over generations and they can't just move into the new world. Does that also play in terms of, very strongly in terms of achieving diversity goals?
I think it could, and it's just as simple as broadband, digital reach, etc. I mean, even thinking yesterday's Monday's budget, we were completing the rural digital broadband facility in the UK. So one, you could quickly be ahead of your developed market competitors in Asia. That's number one. Two is it's not all about the highest technology skills, because if you're developing a consumer market, if you think about Tencent and some of the way the integrated, your financial advisor, your consumer insurance, there's so many different products and services, safety, monitoring of children in my case, but in lots of different ways. But you could develop demand markets. It's not just about high-tech skills and elite technology skills. It really is just about platforms on which you can have great businesses. The other benefit of digital, and particularly equity of access to financial and consumer products, is it allows women to be able to run businesses where they are. You don't have to necessarily move from where you are or reconnect with others. You can form networks online that help you to be able to manage, for example, domestic responsibilities or work locally. Most people prefer and want to be near their homes, and these platforms can help small businesses remain small but remain productive, but bring them into the real economy as opposed to leaving them in the gray economy. So the digital capabilities and platforms are super important, but not just for the high-tech, glossy, big company skills. It's just about access and platforms so that you can work from your home and, frankly, maintain and build smaller businesses as well.
I'm going to invite you to ask questions in just a moment, but one more before we do. I've been a journalist most of my career, covered many companies, many M&As and everything. I can't recall ever seeing a growth strategy for a company, whether it's a turnaround or the big leap forward, that has said, here's where diversity plays a part in our growth strategy. Have you? And if not, why not?
What I would say is diversity is a component of the business strategy and initiative you're applying. I think growing your workforce, a diverse, stable workforce that's from a certain region of Bangladesh or a certain region of Indonesia, if you only do that with a factory that's 80% men, you're missing a growth opportunity. Or if you allow an alternative competitor to grow in a more balanced way, you're going to be competitively disadvantaged, particularly if you promote some of the women to decision-making roles. You're going to be competitively disadvantaged versus another. So the proof is in the doing, and you do see businesses that look at talent, employee mix, supply chain and partnerships, customer and consumer strategies and where spend
Yes.
comes from. And then finally, their reputation and I would say reputation and brand management. But all I can say is while they may not, you may label it your growth strategy. We want to go from 5 factories to 15. You may say we want to have a diverse and more agile, flexible, local supply chain. Those that do that with more gender participation are the more successful companies. So, as I said, successful companies do many things well. We were actually concerned that in Asia the results might be directionally true but not statistically significant,
Yes.
simply because so many companies are growing so fast off of purely demand-led basis.
Yeah.
But it turns out that the same trend is the case, is that the most successful companies also have higher participation, particularly of women in leadership. Where you don't yet see statistical correlation is around some other variables of historic disadvantage. So people with lower socioeconomic backgrounds. If you look at the Maori or population and other ethnic groups within Australia, for example, we believe that more cultural and ethnic diversity aids decision making and helps companies be more successful. The data is there in a UK or a diverse ethnic groups in China because the data set is large enough. In Australia, the data is directional and
Yes.
positive, but it's not yet statistically correlated. So when we look at some of the data that we didn't publish, you'll see that the cultural dimension is there as well. It's just not yet at critical mass in some Asian markets because the numbers aren't there. But for gender, the numbers are there and the math is very easy.
Okay. Did you consider in this study that it's the successful companies who have the resources and the space to implement the bolder, more confident diversity policies, or is basically because they're successful, they are able to make some of these cultural shifts within the organization?
Yes and no. We think it's down more to CEO and leadership commitment than it is the size of companies. You see some smaller and mid-sized companies that are very successful that have a more explicit growth strategy that involves, frankly, all the talented employees they can get. There are some big companies, which I think you'll talk about a little bit later on the panel, that are very substantial and large and successful, by the way, but not as successful relative as their competitors.
Right.
And that's what we're all looking for, is not just a profit pool, but a relative advantage versus others in our sector. So it is unfortunately possible to grow quite well and be quite successful without doing some of these things. We just don't think you'll be able to sustain it, and that you won't get the same participation in balanced rural and urban that countries will need, both for economic growth, but also for stability. Because if there's great economic opportunities where I live in a rural part of a country, people are much more likely to stay near home. They want to be near their families. They want to have good job opportunities near home. Urbanization is positive if you decide it's positive, but if you want to stay where you are and run a mid-sized business from your home, employing 5 to 10 people, that should be an opportunity for you.
Okay, let's open it up to the floor. Who would like to ask the first question? Please, hands in the air, identify yourself, we'll bring around a mic. And name and organisation, please. There and then.
Hello. I'm from the EBRD, and we are very interested in women in business and access to finance. I wonder if you have found any best practice examples of transferring informal into formal businesses led by women with the help of technology, blockchain or mobile transfer of money. I think there is a huge potential there. I agree with you. I just haven't seen a lot of examples of that.
We do have some financial service case studies in this work, but this is deliberately focused on some larger companies, so it still is of interest because they'll move the economy. We wanted to have case studies that were relevant enough that if you did them, it moved the economic needle for a number of employees or at a national level, because it's important for net economic growth. In some of the work that the Global Women's Banking Alliance has done, they've done a lot of examples of just adding technology platforms to small cooperatives and looking at the really very positive and increased participation rates, investment rates, loan repayment rates, the money being spent on its proper uses for education, health, etc. And so they've got a really good set of case studies that we can connect you with. The GBA, I think it's called, with Inez Murray. And the data set, I think, covers Asia as well.
Thank
Okay. Please, just there. Thank you.
Hi,
It's on.
hi. I'm from Herbert Smith Freehills. There's a lot of focus on in OECD countries on the correlation between cost of childcare and women's labor force participation. But in the talent pipeline statistics that we saw, the two outliers were Philippines and Australia.
Yep.
It seems very counterintuitive because presumably the cost of childcare is vastly different in those two countries. So was that at all a parameter in analyzing this study?
The childcare cost, so 2 or 3 elements about once you have a family, the cost of leaving it or not. One clearly relates to the cost of childcare, and that's very rate limiting. Certainly in the UK, that would be the case. For example, in Japan, just very high costs. I think you have to be at a certain income level to pay. Certainly if it's individual care, but we're not talking about individual care and full-time nannies and au pairs. We're just talking about even a group facility in a local community for one woman to maybe be employed looking after 5 or 10 other children for her neighbors and or family, but to be compensated for that as a job. So even the child care assumption we're making is a pretty basic one. And secondly, we also look at unpaid domestic work, because if you don't have other domestic responsibilities shared, you often find that that's rate limiting for women to be able to participate fully in the workforce. They don't want to leave their homes or be seen not to be fulfilling their responsibilities. Or maybe one woman goes off and works, but the rest stay home. So the cost of childcare alone is not the only factor, and it is in high cost areas clearly literal cost of childcare, but in lower cost areas it's more about the social norm of do you leave home and find some other community-based way to make sure your children are looked after during certain age periods. The other thing to remember is that children aren't young all the time. And that's true around the world. At least I hope not, otherwise I'm going to be in big trouble for my 2. And so it really is that period of 0 to 6 or 7, when hopefully they're in school, that is the acute period to solve. And so it's this notion of breaking down the problem and saying, if we have a 5 to 7 year problem, it's not a surprise that most female CEOs in Asia as well as in other parts of the world are typically a few years older than men, not because they've all had children. Some of them have had bias or rate limiting steps in their careers. Others have taken family leave, etc. So the child care problem is an acute one. There are lots of innovative ways to solve it in low income settings, including ones that create jobs for women across their network, and also ones that are related to the amount of money women earn. And the problem with gender pay gaps and lack of equal pay for equal work is that if a woman goes to work and she earns less for the same work as a man, that's a double incentive not to do it. Because if you're a household and you've got one person who's earning well and feels compensated fairly, as a couple, who are you going to ask to go to work? You'll go to the thing. And even now, is in developed economies, when you see many more compensation balanced households where a man and a woman are roughly equivalent earning power, you actually see many more households where men work more flexibly or might stay home. It's economics again, and that is the other factor. But for most rural, fast growth countries, these are not countries with the same GDP per capita as the UK. The city-rural difference is quite significant. It's about creating a network that normally can help with domestic responsibilities, childcare, and others. And then in cities, same as it is in London or Manchester, it's about getting the costs down. And that's where governments can often play a big role in terms of the cost and quality of childcare. Because if we had access to good, affordable childcare, many more women would work.
Okay, so
Please.
Morning, Vivian. Frank McKenna from Harvey Nash. We're a global leadership services business. I was really interested looking at your data that if you were thinking about middle management and executive positions, that Singapore and Philippines were way ahead of Australia.
Yes.
But then zooming out, looking at Australia compared to the US and the UK, that Australia was further ahead. I just wondered whether you would comment about that. And your findings, is it the same in terms of public and private organisations, whether there's a differentiator in terms of progress around female participation in high-level roles?
Well, our data set covers only private sector organizations. It covers the largest and fastest growing ones. So it'll have some gaps in it in terms of platform businesses and obviously the public sector. And what I would just say is, what we know for sure in every country and every data set is that it is about women in leadership positions. And we're not doing as well as we thought we were. And in fact, many of the developed markets have stalled. The good thing for Asia is that they're still at a point of net absolute growth, women's participation and women's participation in leadership. So frankly, we wouldn't be hugely technical or comparative. I don't think that Singapore has a magic formula relative to Australia. The numbers in both places, in absolute terms, are actually low. But what Singapore, as a hyper-concentration talent market, illustrates is that if you do make more of the appointments, you actually see a higher return.
Okay. So the lady there, then Martin.
Thank you. My question is, UK's economy is characterised by a very high percentage of small, medium-sized enterprises.
Yes.
I work in Nottingham, live in Leicester. The rate is about 88%.
Yes.
I mean, you mentioned the report focused mainly on financial and technology companies, larger companies. Now, given how important the SME play a role in the economy, how important or how much difference or the stats support the same when it comes to larger companies and SMEs?
So our data set includes 3,600 private sector companies that account for 90% or something of the economy that we can count. Right? So that's going to have a lot of big companies in it. We did complete the analysis. We did include all of the rest of the companies. They are hugely important in terms of aggregate employment. You know, most people in employment in the UK, as you point out, same as in Asia, are with local businesses, small and mid-sized enterprises, be it 5 or be it 500. It's still small relative to, you know, a BHP Billiton or a Tencent. So those companies are included in the data set, and the correlations around women, particularly in leadership, applies to them as well. You even see it with family-run businesses that have both men and women in the family managing the business versus just the men in the family. And so we don't ignore that. Secondly, platform businesses and the benefit and efficiencies that technology can substitute for, particularly if you haven't built or bought the software now, but built or bought substitutes now, are super important for small businesses. My husband is an entrepreneur, and you can for sure grow in a smarter way, meaning using less capital to get to the same growth. And often in Asia, labor is substituted for capital. Less expensive labor is substituted for capital. And so if you can use digital means of scheduling and managing just very simple things as a small business, you can grow. So the study doesn't ignore small businesses. They're hugely important for distributed growth, hugely important for employment count, and hugely important for, frankly, people working wherever they choose to work, not having to migrate to certain jobs and types. It's just that the numbers, even when you add them all up, it's a big employment number, but net growth for Indonesia, net growth for Malaysia, net growth for Vietnam, the big companies and the big platforms still matter.
Okay, Mark.
Martin Barrow, the Jardine Matheson Group. Vivian, thank you for your presentation. I was particularly interested in your statistics on Japan, where I lived for many years. Clearly, Prime Minister Abe has a lot more work to do on womenomics to make progress. And
Yes.
It's coming, but a lot more to do. Now, I just wanted to broaden the point a little bit on the subject. I mean, looking at the UK as an example,
Yes.
what do you see as the linkage between diversity and for the country to be open and welcoming to investors, students and tourists? I mean, I'm always putting the message across government, we've got to have clear messages, not just global Britain, which doesn't even have a meaning when it's translated in Chinese or Japanese. We've got to get around the world that we are open and welcoming. How do you think that links in with diversity in terms of progressing the cause?
Well, I think there are two important observations. One is people will stay in a company, in a neighborhood, in a country where they feel welcome. Now, I have the luxury of worrying about how I feel after I have some of my basic requirements taken care of. Safety for my family, access to reasonable health care, a job that's secure, an education that's portable. And so when you think about the highly competed for technology talent that's required for growth in Asia, it's growth everywhere, but literally is competed for, they worry about that sense of belonging and feeling. And so even with McKinsey, which could not be a more global, welcoming office, our UK and Ireland offices are the most diverse, is literally the most diverse office of our entire firm. We still have to have the conversations and reminding our colleagues, particularly in today's environment, that we are open, welcome, and inclusive of people of all patterns. If you are not yet in a position where you have those basic security elements in your life, which many rural, poor, context, underemployed, poor homes in Asia don't yet have, how the feeling in the environment's not yet a choice they can make. But what I would say is that it is particularly for talent that is secure and can move. If you have a degree of any type and you can move between cities in your country or move between countries with your talent, how you message and the tone around, particularly Britain at this time, being open and welcoming to talent is very important. Our issue is not particularly Brexit. That's an important event that we need to manage through, but it really is about our relative competitiveness versus Asia. That's really the big conundrum for relevance and how UK and Asia can participate together and grow together so that Asian companies can participate in full global markets and UK companies can continue to punch above their weight in high growth places like Asia. And if you don't feel welcome, whether you've got 3 degrees and 10 job offers or you have no degree but still don't feel welcome or safe, you're not going to move to pursue the economic opportunities. So I think it's incredibly important, but it is by itself not enough. You need the other building blocks, particularly in Asia. But I would agree with you, simple messaging, the marketing companies might call it branding, is hugely important because talented people of any type, even if you have one skill, you will go use that skill where you feel most welcome.
Okay. One final question, because we are running out of time, and Madam, I know you've been trying to...
Hi, this is Manjari Prasad from Cranfield School of Management. So my question is to sort of bring up the point about cultural diversity and gender diversity, bringing those two together. So in my research and my work with multinationals, what I find is they sort of develop diversity and inclusive approaches in the home country, usually in the UK or the US, and deploy it across their global offices. And my research on women's careers in India shows that, in fact, I would challenge you on life stages and when the concern for children is. It isn't actually at the younger age where they tend to have some family support and help. It's really later on in life as the children get older, and if there's any performance issues or health issues, it becomes the woman's. So that's when senior managerial women, anyway, would drop out. So initiatives to improve women's participation for multinationals on a global can't be that tied to national, need to be adjusted. And in fact, we go in with the Western view, and I was wondering if you could help me convince my clients that they need to look at it in a more nuanced fashion.
Well, the pipelines of women's participation in the workforce, and this data set only includes women, it does include other characteristics of diversity. It's just the data set's not statistically significant enough yet for us to be able to publish it, although we did look at it in our analysis. But the bottlenecks, where the problems are at different points, and I absolutely agree with you. Young child care is an acute issue, for example, in the UK, in cities. If you have more of a family-based structure, families live closer to each other, etc., you're exactly right. Sometimes communal child care covered by families and or care that's less expensive is not where the problem is. It's later when children present different complexities and or if there's a pressure, it's the woman who makes the trade-off versus the man. So, and you see that very clearly in the data in the fall-off in India when it actually comes later than it comes, for example, certainly in the UK and even in Japan. So our data doesn't suggest that it's one size fits all, and what we're hoping to do is get more granularity by country and by region so that we get better solutions to the problems. And I think this data set would support that argument.
I'm afraid we have to leave it. Look, we've clearly got many more questions. I'm really sorry we're out of time. In fact, we've run over time. Vivian, thank you so much. Fantastic piece of work. obviously, you know, enormously complex issues facing some lots and lots of questions. Do come back again. Let's follow this up if we may.
We will
because I'm
do,
sure there's
and
huge interest.
We're happy to do that either by industry sector or by country, depending on what your focus is, because we just want it to be used and applied. It's not meant for anything other than companies and policymakers to debate, disagree with some parts of it, agree with others, but hopefully get on with doing something. And if we do that, then it'll have been useful.
Wonderful. Please join me in thanking Vivian.